On today's show, I'm going to be talking with JD Ellenberger. He is a multi-talent. He is an actor, writer, director, I think musician, and sometime model. But today we're especially going to talk about a film project that he did called Noctambulist, which is out on home video, and a sneak preview on a brand new project that I don't think he's talked too much about. So welcome to the show, JD.
Thank you, my friend. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh my God. Well, I've been following your career for a while, and you've been, I wouldn't say rebranding yourself, but I see you kind of moving from goth, punk, tattoo, what's the word? Kind of like a very alternative scene into maybe a slightly more traditional kind of neo Edgar Allan Poe, late 1800s sort of gentleman of the neo-noir genre.
Well, I guess it's probably more prevalent nowadays, but that's always been an underlying factor to me. I just always looked like, the punk rock, sometimes greaser type guy, but there's many layers.
Well, I like the Poe
I
thing, because it
suppose,
seems like people who like Edgar Allan Poe, there's a lot of overlap in the goth community and just sort of the romantic side of Poe. And it seems like you've been embracing some more classic styles.
The Poe influence has been there since I was probably 11 years old. That's always been there, and that's always been there. That's always been the most prevalent aspect of my writing. I've just never showed it off until more recent years. I guess the best way to really go into that or delve into that remark would be that, the internet is a very crazy world, as we all know, and it gets crazier by the day. But I first started writing seriously when I was 10, 11, 12 years of age. Poe was the one that inspired me, and so I had always written along those darker literary lines, following in Poe's footsteps. When I got into the world of horror, which was completely by accident as far as filmmaking goes, I had no idea what direction I wanted to go. I never aspired to be a filmmaker. I was always a musician and a writer first, and I accidentally fell into the world of horror filmmaking, and it takes a long time to really figure yourself out. I knew where I was as a writer, but in my first short film, Samhain Night Feast, is very Hitchcockian. Edgar Allan Poe and Alfred Hitchcock, I would say, are two of my biggest influences and have been since I was a kid. But when I wrote my first attempt at a feature film, which never ended up seeing the light of day, because I hadn't figured out where I wanted to go as a director, what direction, I think that the script was somewhere between like street trash and trauma films meet it's just weird. It was all over the place and it wasn't really me. And, there were a few years where I almost quit making films altogether. And then when I finally realized that, no, this is in my blood, I need to do it. It took me about 5 years to really figure out my identity and who I was. And I went back to who I was as a young Johnny at the age of 10 or 11. And that was the more morose Poe and, Alfred Hitchcock, Rod Serling, Twilight Zone, and stuff like that.
Nice. Well, it seems like...
But because...
Right, it seems like part of that
go ahead, I'm sorry.
transformation or just your segue into, who you are now was a book you wrote a couple of years ago called Neverlasting, where you just seem to go even more all-out Poe in that.
Yeah, it's funny because what I wanted to mention is that because the internet, it's just really weird. As I mentioned, I never meant to be a filmmaker. It fell into my lap because I won a short film festival with my first release. And then Caustic Zombies, which was my attempt. I know you wanted to talk a bit about that. That was my first attempt at a feature, which could have really been cool, but we just had some setbacks that and I'm glad that it never saw the light of day. But from the very moment that I started Caustic Zombies, the concept of that, I started getting interview requests from Europe and all around the world. And it was like immediately, because of the internet and the technology that we have, all eyes were focused on me. And I didn't even know my damn craft at the time, let alone the direction that I wanted to go. And I was all of a sudden I was thrust under this microscope, which, to be quite honest, was very uncomfortable. Imagine, I really do wish that, I would have started filmmaking back in the early 80s when there wasn't all of this technology and social media where people would be following every move, because, I needed time to grow and to find myself and to learn my craft. But instead, from the minute I started, I was immediately under the microscope. And, I don't have to tell you how uncomfortable that could be, at times. And now I'm finally to the point with Noctambulist, which was released 2 years ago now, that I finally found my calling.
Sure.
And,
Well, we're going to talk more about Noctambulist and your new project. But I have to start off by saying, what you're saying about your first projects, I'm a little jealous, because those people who have worked longer in obscurity and don't get that immediate notice, and it is a double-edged sword. I'd say, if you get it, go for it. It's like this blessing that people are connecting to you so quickly. And it seems like, especially back when you did it, when we didn't have as many podcasts and all these ways to promote ourselves online, that you were finding those pretty early on. Did you actually have your own early podcast yourself?
Well, I've had multiple podcasts over the years, but I've never, like, especially with Caustic Zombies, all the media attention with that, I never sought it out. It was somehow, people were seeing posts on Facebook and contacting me. I never sought it out at the time. But as far as podcasts go, I mean, I was actually one of the first podcasters back in the late 90s when it first started on Live 365. I think Live 365 is still around to this day, but I did a podcast which was more of a fan podcast. One of my all-time favorite bands is The Cure, and I had a all Cure all the time podcast, 24 hours a day. You could tune in and listen to live performances, or I was fortunate enough to interview the majority of the band members, past and present, so you could tune in for interviews and whatnot. And then after that, I did some punk magazine. Well, prior to that, I did some punk and rockabilly magazines and some goth magazines. And then in 2010 or 11, my one-time Dagger Vision co-partner, Brian Coddington, suggested that we do a horror podcast. So we started the Dagger Vision Films podcast. I think it was 2011, and we did that for a while. And then I just recently had another podcast, which was kind of short-lived. I like to promote everybody as much as possible, but I'm constantly working around the clock, so it makes it tough to find the time to do a show and promote others when I'm trying to work so much on my upcoming material.
See, I think one reason why you took off so quickly is you had such a cool name at the time. Johnny Daggers. And then you had Dagger Visions, which I still love. I hope you still keep Dagger Visions for some of your projects.
Nope, Dagger Visions is now deceased.
Oh, God. Well, that's okay. A lot of people have different, phases of their career. But I'd say the other thing, too, is I think you understood fan culture. And now that you say you had these fan, podcasts, like it seems like you show up at a horror convention. People know exactly where to program you into it. You're just, I think, easy to grasp quickly, especially, in your early work. When you enter a room, it's like, oh, wow, this guy's something special. Let's talk to him.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Again, going back to not intentionally planning on being a filmmaker, and I was a musician at the time, Johnny Daggers was just a nickname that, my friends had given me over the years, because I was always into rockabilly and 50s culture, and, always had a switchblade on me. And my buddy Dustin one day was like, hey, Johnny Daggers. And it kind of just stuck with my friends. And then when I was getting into filmmaking, I'm like, I don't know what the hell to go by. I guess I'll just use what I've been called. And, I guess just over the years, as I started taking my craft much more seriously, because in the early days, it was very punk rock. It was, as we've talked about this before, and I know that your style, we kind of groove on the same thing, where it was very guerrilla style. You pick up a camera, you get a bunch of friends, as many as you can, and just go shoot a movie. Mm-hmm. And that's really how it all started out. And that, at the time, Johnny Daggers really fit that style of filmmaking. But probably around 2014, early 2015, when I was at a crossroads, I still wasn't really taking filmmaking seriously at that point. I mean, truth be told, there were a lot of reasons why Caustic Zombies never saw the light of day. And not that this is one of the reasons, but, I would show up on the set with a 6-pack or a 12-pack, and I'd be drinking while I was directing. And to me, it was just a fun party thing, and, in 2015, when I was basically, I was offered a distribution deal with SGL Entertainment. And I realized, okay, this is my chance to get really serious and do this as a professional. And there were things that I needed to, clean up about myself, such as drinking while directing, and just picking up a camera and going out on a whim, and just almost getting arrested because you don't have film permits. And with Caustic Zombies, we walked into obviously post 9/11, without any without any regard. We just walked into uh, a military base, more or less, that had it was a power plant, but basically they looked like they had nuclear reactors on their site, which is what we were going for with Caustic Zombies. So we just strolled up without any forewarning. Next thing you know, a military Jeep comes flying up over the hill, MP in his Jeep with a gun drawn on us. He had no idea what we were doing there. So it was just really crazy and haphazard. So, once I started taking things very seriously and said, okay, you know what, going into Noctambulist, everything needs to be professional. My decorum needs to be more professional. And I just thought that, you have some squares. And I know in the past that, some of my friends have said to me that there were certain people in the media that were like, is this Johnny Daggers guy? Like, is he okay to interview? It was like the name kind of was intimidating to a lot of people. And so when I decided to take myself more seriously, I don't know. I mean, many people look at how many times, Bowie either went by Aladdin Sane or Ziggy Stardust or, David Bowie was always changing his look and his styles and his image. But I think it was always within him to begin with. And, I guess that's kind of the way that I see myself as always transforming, hopefully for the better.
Drinking while directing, it's kind of like singing karaoke while drinking.
Yeah.
Inside, you think you're doing better, but you really aren't.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah.
Right,
Because I used to love karaoke, and I just remember everyone goes, "Oh, I'll have a few drinks and loosen up." Never helped. It actually got worse and worse with every drink. You thought you were having fun and sounding good.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about specific projects. But I love that, you're in Baltimore. Are you from Baltimore originally?
No, I'm a transient. I moved here about 8 years ago.
Okay, so you've had 8 years there, and we've talked about this. I've been to Baltimore once, and, I have this soft spot for, John Waters. And, Baltimore is his town, and it just represents, guerrilla filmmaking, and especially underground filmmaking. So I just want to know, in these 8 years, how much of that have you absorbed? Was that part of the reason for coming, that you thought this would be a welcoming artistic community for you?
No.
Oh my God, you can lie and say yes.
Well, I tell you what.
I mean, are you a John Waters fan? Do you love that style?
To a point.
Yeah.
To a point. I moved here for, my relationship. And I'm a hermit. I'm very reclusive. I'm a shut-in. I literally stay inside. In fact, with this pandemic, it hasn't really changed my life at all. I think I've left twice in the past year since the pandemic started, and that's about on par to how I normally am. However, the few times that I have gotten out to see Baltimore over the years, there are certain parts that I absolutely love. I really do. Obviously, Baltimore has a high crime rate, and so there's a lot of places that you either don't want to frequent or you don't want to spend a lot of time in. For instance, I'm a huge Billie Holiday fan. She's always been one of my all-time favorite singers, jazz singers. And I remember, my fiance, before we went to go see the Billie Holiday statue that they have erected in Baltimore, she's like, I'm telling you right now, it's a really shady area. It's dicey at times. So she's like, I'm going to pull the car up. you can run over, get your picture taken with the statue, and then hurry up and jump back in the car, and we're taking off. Just because there's a lot of drive-bys and crime in that particular area. And sadly, that's to be found with a lot of Baltimore. But my favorite place to visit, obviously Poe was, had Baltimore as his home for a while. There's a place that Poe used to frequent. It was a bar. It's called the Horse You Came In On Saloon. And they still have his original bar stool there. So you can go to the saloon, you can sit in Poe's chair and have a pint. I've done that multiple times. Gone to the Poe House, the Poe Museum, but I don't really get out there.
When you sat in his chair at the bar, did you feel Poe?
I would like to say that I felt a little bit of his presence in there. There are reports that he actually haunts that bar. For instance, if somebody's being out of line, there's been reports where a gentleman is not acting so gentlemanly and gets out of line with, advances on a female. And all of a sudden he goes to sit down and the bar stool just flies completely out from underneath of him for no apparent reason. And, there's a lot of haunting stories about that pub in Edgar Allan Poe. I didn't have anything cool like that happen to me, but I definitely felt some type of spirit around me.
Do you remember that Poe story where the guy bricks that other guy up? He's got the brick and the concrete, and he,
bricks him in the wall.
Yeah, what was that story called?
I always butcher the pronunciation of that. The cast of Monty.
The cask of Amontillado or something like that.
Something along those lines. I always butcher that.
Because seeing you there with your brick background, I mean, did your wife brick you up into a room, or is this a bomb shelter, or where exactly are you? You're in this. You look like you're in a Poe wine cellar.
Yeah, it does look that way. No, I'm just here in my living room and with the brick backdrop that I got specifically for your show today. So.
It looks very realistic.
Oh, cool.
It's better than mine. I just had this old piece of fabric that kind of covers everything, but then you can see all the crap around it, but it's its own aesthetic.
I really had to work hard on the framing so that I wouldn't have any any of the side, of the living room.
So you're better at art direction than I am. So you have an artistic eye, and that's one thing I noticed as we move on and talk about Noctambulist, your neo-noir. It's not only black and white, but silent movie. And I think this is when I think JD Ellenberger really came out, the gentleman horror filmmaker / neo-noir. And there's just a really elegant look. It takes place in another time. What is it, the 1920s?
Yes, a nondescript time.
Nondescript, depending on, what costumes you could get from Goodwill.
Right. Well, yeah. Luckily, I mean, we couldn't find any on Goodwill, but luckily eBay had a lot of great wardrobes to choose from.
That's another thing people don't realize when you do a period piece, how difficult it is, and that can be like the biggest part of your budget just for the wardrobe. And people think everything is available, but you picture something in your mind and you try to find it. Some stuff is not that easy to find. Like, how did you assemble costumes and locations and props and cars? How did you start all this?
See, it honestly, I often tell this to people, it was meant to be. Some films aren't meant to be. Some films start, and for whatever reason, whether it's lack of funds or not being able to procure certain locations or just turmoil with the cast, some things just aren't meant to happen and they get pushed on the back burner. So with Noctambulist, that is the film that I've always wanted to make since I got into filmmaking in 2010. But I knew at that time that I didn't have the skill set to make it properly and that I didn't have the dedication to make it properly. And I knew that when the time was right, at least I hoped that when the time was right, that it would get made. So around late 2014, 2015, I wrote the script for it. And I did a lot of study. I did the cinematography on that film as well. And, I studied a lot of camera angles from not just the 20s, but a lot of the noir. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
even Alfred Hitchcock got his start, with noir and carried that on through his films. So my love for early German expressionist films and silent noir films, I just studied as much as I could as far as the camera angles, the lighting. I started writing a script, and how everything fell into place was really pretty crazy. It was probably a once in a lifetime thing. But I reached out to a friend of mine who's a hair and makeup artist. Her name's Buffy Roman Fox. And I was introduced to her when I first moved to Baltimore. And I promised her that we would work on something together in the future, but wasn't sure what. So after I had written the script, I reached out to Buffy and I said, I would love for you to do the hair and makeup, but you have to go through all the old photos from the early 1900s, study how the actors and actresses wore their makeup, what the hair was like, what the wardrobe was like. I wanted it to be it's difficult making, a silent 1920s film in 2015, but I wanted it to be the best that it could be. So
Mm-hmm.
I started telling her, I was like, I need a 1920s Model A or Model T, whatever we can find. We need wardrobes. We need a house. Like, how are we going to find an era appropriate home? And lo and behold, two of her best friends, Bonnie Shipley Pill and Steve Summerlin, own a home that was built in the late 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And their entire house was furnished with 1920s antiquities.
Wow.
So Buffy said, let me reach out to Bonnie and Steve and see if we can use their place to film. And they were just super thrilled about it.
Mm-hmm.
Bonnie came on to help out as a wardrobe consultant along with Buffy doing the hair and makeup. Steve really helped out a lot as far as any set design or just making sure that everything was era appropriate. And so we had a house, we had all the antiquities. There are certain scenes where there's, like a boggy marsh, where the riverman at the river Styx, the ferryman comes. I don't want to give too much away, but they had all of that on their property.
Wow.
From the lake to the house to the yard, everything was right there at our
And for
disposal.
low budget
Other than the
filmmaking,
vehicle.
to have, fewer locations is key. So that's pretty amazing. You had the outdoor scenes there too.
We had everything there except for the vehicle. And because I'm into 50s culture and car clubs and whatnot, I just put a post out on a antique car page and said, hey, I'm looking for a 1920s vehicle. Lo and behold, a gentleman lived probably 15 minutes away from where we were filming, replied and said, hey, I have a 1921 Model T. You're welcome to use it. I'll bring it down. He dropped it off and didn't even stay to watch. He's like, nah, just call me when you're done with it. Like, how many people are that cool with their antique vehicles?
That's
so
trusting.
We had that.
You must elicit trust pretty quickly in people.
I would like to think so. And then I'm assuming you've seen the film. There's a shot where we filmed this entire bit in a mausoleum, which wasn't even planned. We initially went there to just use the cemetery for the day, and we ended up running into the groundskeeper. And this mausoleum was like 4 stories tall, and it was so beautiful. And we just asked the gentleman, we said, look, we're working on an indie film. We would love it if you would open up the mausoleum and let us film inside. And he's like, have at it. He's like, as long as you promise not to disturb anything, you can use the whole mausoleum and film whatever you would like. And so we had this whole entire pickup scene that wasn't even planned that was shot in the mausoleum, which just added so much to the production value.
And you have to be that daring, if you're so timid and to be an independent filmmaker, you don't get that production value. But I did see the movie. It's one thing I take pride in. Generally, when I interview someone and they've got a movie or something, it's like, yeah, I want to see it before I talk to them. And I've seen your other work too, but what I liked about the movie was it opened, I think, with the car. And right off the bat, you gave that production value. So right away, you're transformed to another era. And I think that was really smart to do that right off the bat. And it kind of reminded me of, do you remember that movie Paper Moon with Ryan O'Neal?
I can't say that.
Oh, you're younger than I am. Well, it came out in the early 70s, had Tatum O'Neal, Ryan O'Neal, and took place during the Depression. So when I saw that opening car scene, it made me think of that movie, which was good because I think in the 70s, having that nostalgia for the 20s, it's interesting to see you in this era having nostalgia for the 20s, because I think we're in a little gap now. I haven't seen a lot of 1920s nostalgia lately. You know, everything comes in cycles. But it seems like for a lot of
Yeah.
younger people, you know, that to them, that's practically, you know, what we thought of as like the Civil War era. You know, it's just kind of funny that, you know, a 19-year-old now thinks the 1990s is so, you know, vintage.
What? Yeah, they do. It's bizarre. I mean, for me, I'm approaching 50, much sooner than I would like. But I've always really been, immersed anything between the 20s to 50s. The funny thing about it is,
Hmm.
I found out through ancestry and just through legend and lores of family members that during Prohibition, my family members used to own a speakeasy in Pennsylvania. And I found that out years back. And when I found that out, that really, like, I used to be a 50s rockabilly greaser guy, like hardcore. And then years back, when I found out that my family had actually owned a speakeasy during Prohibition, and then I found out that other relatives of mine that were Irish immigrants also had a speakeasy. So I had at least two sets of family members, own a speakeasy. I really just started getting more immersed in, the 20s
Hmm.
Prohibition era. So
Well, when you were growing
the
up,
temperance movement and all
besides
that.
like The Cure, what were like the bands and music that really influenced you?
I've always been a bit all over. I'm fortunate because my father was young. My mother and father were both young when they had me. My dad was 18, my mother was 17. My dad liked a lot of punk rock and new wave music. So, growing up in the early 70s, I was exposed to Devo, and my dad had the first Stray Cats vinyl on record, and the New York Dolls and Elvis Costello, very early Elvis Costello. So I grew up listening to all that as it was coming out. I was too young to go to shows, unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
but because of my father, I got to listen to all the, early punk and post punk as it was happening. And that stuff was hugely, had a huge impact on me. And that just never left. And then, I just started as I got older, finding more of my own bands that fell into those, post punk and new wave and kind of
Were you
pre-punk
even too
eras. So
much goth music or the goth scene?
yeah, once I got to be about 10 years old, I was huge into the Batcave scene and the death rock scene. Bauhaus, Joy Division. Obviously, I loved Susie and the Banshees and The Cure. Specimen. All the early Tones on Tail. A lot of the early, Batcave
Hmm.
bands. So.
So at what point, you know,
And then I found out, psychobilly and gothabilly, which really transformed me because I'm like, this is fantastic. I was into rockabilly and into goth before I discovered that there's now psychobilly and gothabilly, and I found that out with the Cramps when I was probably 11
mhm,
years old. And that was very transformative,
mhm.
and still one of my favorite bands to this day because they just combine it all. So,
Yeah, I can definitely see that influence in your work. But I wonder, you know, at what point you're liking the music, you know, you're getting into the scene, you're getting some ink, and you're just starting to, you know, to transform yourself. At what point were people
mhm.
starting to notice and think, wow, you know, Johnny's got this look. We want him in our magazine. We want a
Oh,
little piece of you somehow because we're inspired by your look.
well, I mean, I would definitely say my parents, especially my mother, took notice first, and she wasn't very happy. I can tell you that. I was probably 12 years old when I painted my entire bedroom black, and I got black tarp paper and boarded my windows shut. And, she ransacked my room at one point looking for drugs, which I've never done drugs in my life, believe it or not. I've always been a drinker, but never done any drugs. But in a positive way, I would guess, that probably wasn't, you know, I mean, I was in bands from the time I was 12 and
Mhm.
on, and a lot of that was pre-internet days. That had a lot of
Like, what
um,
were some of the
publicity
bands?
as
What
far
were
as
the names of your
fans and
bands?
nothing of notoriety. I think the first band that I was ever in, it's so ridiculous when I think about it now, but it was me, my buddy Ken, and my other buddy Josh. We formed this three-piece punk band called Voss, which was an acronym for Victims of Society, and we would skateboard all around this town and spray paint Voss on the car wash and other things. We thought we were super cool. And then by mid to late 90s, the most notable band that I was in was a death rock band, which was heavily inspired by Christian Death and 45 Grave and the death rock bands of Los Angeles, from the early 80s. And that band was called Black Mass 99. And we actually could have had a record deal. We really wanted to be signed on Frontier Records, who Frontier Records released, the early Christian Death records, I believe some of the 45 Grave records. I don't know if the Circle Jerks were released on there, but they had close ties with the label because of the tight-knit community. And, we had recorded a 5-song demo, and I sent it off to Lisa Fancher, Frontier Records, and she's like, I love this. I would sign you guys in a heartbeat, but I can't sign you on a demo.
Yeah.
She said, you have to go into the studio, record, an actual album, and then send that to me, and we'll sign you guys. So at the time, I was working construction, and I was making really good money, and I told the rest of the band, look, I will pay for the studio time. We can get signed to Frontier. All we have to do is go into the studio, get the record cut. Well, at the time, I was, 21, 20, and my drummer and guitarist, they were only 17 or 18. And they didn't really care, They would rather hang out with their girlfriend than to be away playing gigs or going into the studio. So, we actually had a big show. It was a death rock show in New York City called the Pyramid Club. And it was like the second or third death rock festival. It had bands like, who was on there now? The Brickbats. They were an early 90s horror punk band, the Brickbats. And there were some other bands, and we were supposed to play the bill with them. But, our drummer would say, oh, it's too hot. I don't feel like practicing today. And one thing led to another. We never did the festival. We never got the record cut just because there was lack of dedication from everybody around there, except, for myself at the time. But, so music is, was always my love and what I, anticipated on doing the majority of my life instead of film.
But it seems like you learned from that you probably had the higher work ethic than the people around you. At that point, did you realize you didn't want to be at the mercy of other people who weren't as dedicated as you were?
Absolutely right. I mean, still to this day, and I don't say this braggadociously at all or to take any credit for anything. But, with Noctambulist, I wrote it, I directed it, I did the cinematography, I did the editing, because I did the editing. I met so many people over the years that would just flake out. And I thought to myself, and I've done graphic design at least half of my life. And then you have the music aspect where I could compose a little bit of music for things. And I just thought, learn as much as you possibly can. If I had to give any advice to an aspiring filmmaker, it would be to get your own equipment, which I never had until Noctambulist. Noctambulist, I went out, made sure that I bought my own movie camera, that I had my own lighting, that I had all my own gear, that if somebody would flake out on me, that I could just pick up with my cast and crew and we could go film.
Yeah.
And, I'm not saying that I'm a master of any trade. The old expression, a jack of all trades and master of none. That's what I would say about myself, but at least I'm not reliant and beholden to anybody that might not take the project as serious as myself.
Yeah.
So.
Well, one reason I brought up, the modeling, because when you look at your resume, that's a big part of you. You had, a specific section, but it also kind of goes back to the days when, for goth culture, punk culture, pre-internet, the only way to communicate was through these magazines, which I thought were so cool. Very often, it was mostly, female models, but it's also a rare place to see models with tattoos and body piercings and, goth fetish. And so I think you stood out because you were one of the rare guys, doing this. But also, what you were doing, creating a name for yourself, Johnny Daggers back there now, with your hat and your, more retro style here. It seems like you've always had a visual sense to you that makes you stand out. And this was all pre-Instagram. And I just look at these magazines as the closest to what we had to Instagram, where you could promote yourself with your images. And I'm just wondering, what are some of your memories of appearing in these magazines and really communicating with fans and other artists through these magazines?
If I'm being completely honest, at first I wasn't thrilled about it. I think that once filmmaking, as I mentioned from the start, I had constant media attention on me, which I didn't really want at first. But they were asking for interviews, and then they would say, "Do you have any publicity photos that you could give us to coincide with the interview?" And so I'd have to schedule a photo shoot. And so at first, the majority of the photo shoots that I were doing were more or less just for the magazines that were doing interviews. And then at one point, um, a modeling agency had found my photos and sent me an email asking if I would sign on to their modeling agency. So I did that, and that was probably like 2 or 3 years I did that. And I mean, I really just took it as fun, more or less. I didn't really take the modeling as serious. It was just something. I lost my earbuds.
Oh, it's right below your tie. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. This is so weird to get used to. I'm not used to having the earbuds in. But so, the modeling was just something that I really just kind of laughed at and didn't take too seriously. But I thought if my image is going to be out there, there was a certain way that I wanted people to perceive me. And so I did take the shoots very seriously, and I planned them out much like I would do a film set, And I would say that out of everything that I'm probably most proud of is, I don't know if you remember Bazaar magazine or not. It was the UK's #1 alternative magazine. Actually, I think it was the world's #1 alternative modeling magazine for the longest time. And I think the last year that they were in production, they had always just had female models in their magazine. And the very last year that they were in publication, I guess due to female customer request, they decided to do their first and only feature with male models. And it was, they had a spot in the magazine called the Viper's Nest or the Viper's Den. And they picked 5 or 6 guys from all around the world to appear in the magazine, and that was it. And I was one of the models selected. So it was kind of an honor to say, okay, out of, all the male models in the world, I'm one of 5 or 6 guys that actually made it in Bazaar magazine for the only time that they did a male model feature. So, that was an honor. I wasn't happy about the magazine when it came out. I was actually pretty embarrassed. But it wasn't because of the photos. They had asked some very personal love life questions to coincide, and they never, at least as far as I know, I wasn't aware that they were going to publish that with the photos. So it actually had a lot of very personal, romantic stories that I thought they were just filler questions to see if I was the type of person they would like to put in the magazine. And then they ended up publishing those. So I'm like, Mom, that magazine I told you to go to Barnes and Nobles and buy, you might not want to buy that now. But,
in doing a search on you, I see that you still have a profile on Model Mayhem, which is for an independent modeling site, if you want to promote yourself. If someone looked you up on that and had a decent offer, would you still model for a magazine?
It's funny that you say that because I would. And I have. Like, I would say that I probably quit modeling in 2015. As far as, because I was, at that point in time, I was doing a lot of photo shoots that weren't just related to my movies. I was doing professional modeling. And 2017, no, maybe it was 2018, I got approached to do a Bonnie and Clyde photo shoot for Garters and Grill magazine, which was nothing pertaining to my films at all. But I've always loved the story of Bonnie and Clyde, and of course, that time period. So I jumped on it, and my fiance and I did a photo shoot. She was Bonnie and I was Clyde, and we did this really cool Bonnie and Clyde photo shoot that had like a 5-page spread in Garters and Grill magazine. And then within the past year, I have been contacted from some Baltimore photographer in particular that wanted me to do a vintage style photo shoot. But I kind of put it off for the time being just because I was so busy, and the fact that I am a recluse and I suffer from extreme anxiety. And that it's one reason why I don't really leave my house or do much of anything. I just kind of passed on that. But I would probably, I would probably do a shoot.
There's a big trend now with mature male models. And it's kind of interesting that people are embracing that. Now that you're approaching 50, I could actually see you getting more work especially with this kind of a vintage throwback look to you? Could you see yourself? I can even see you like modeling tweed suits and doing very mainstream modeling.
That's really hard to say, and a lot of it again comes down to my anxiety that I have. I mean, probably 2 years ago, I didn't realize it at the time, but I actually had a full psychotic breakdown
Mm.
2 years ago, to the point where I couldn't use my fingers or my hands. I thought I had MS for a while, and I would go to the keyboard and I would try to play songs that I had written for, that I wrote 15 years ago that I could play in my sleep. And I either couldn't remember parts or I couldn't get my fingers to move to the keys that I wanted them to. And like, I was just like, I finally realized, I'm like, I had a complete and total mental breakdown about 2 years
Mm.
ago. And although I've gotten better and have recovered from that, I still have extreme anxiety. I haven't driven a car in probably 5 or 6 years. I stopped doing horror conventions probably in 2013.
Well,
I'm just so I try to work remotely as much as possible, which is great given that now I can be a professional filmmaker full time and an author full time. That I don't really have to interact with people other than when we're filming. But it's very crippling, and I've probably divulged more personal information than I planned on. But the only way to answer your question, honestly, would say it really just
mm.
depends.
Do you think your creative work intensifies the anxiety, or do you think it relieves it? Do you get to work through certain things through your work?
It's a very good question. I would say probably both. If I'm not working, if I take a hiatus for any period of time, even if it's just for a day or two, I start to panic. I need to be working. I need to work around the clock.
Hmm.
So when I'm not working, I'm absolutely miserable. So I think that it's more of a help than it is a hinder. But it's a little bit of a catch-22 with that. So I mean, the fact that the anxiety is always there, it prevents me from doing a lot of things that I should be doing. I should have been out at conventions for Noctambulist, but then I think about it and going back to the pre-internet days, and I think of all the obscure bands that we found just from digging through fanzines or old magazines. And so, I can bypass doing conventions and I can do interviews from my home with any magazine or any podcast. And somebody will say, look, we found this really obscure filmmaker, Johnny Daggers or JD Ellenberger, whoever, whichever name pops up, and, they can find my work. So, I don't know, man. And then there's no rhyme or reason for why. I've always been very nervous, but my anxiety since moving to Baltimore is, I don't know if it was a change in scenery and not being familiar with my
Sure.
surroundings, but it really had a psychological impact on me.
Do you
But it
think
also helps my creative.
Edgar Allan Poe, he sort of had a dark, moody sort of a persona to him? Do you think that's a connection you feel? It seems like he had a lot of personal demons that he was battling.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's why I have always related to his work so much. Another interesting story I found out, I never knew my grandfather, my dad's dad. He died when my dad was only 3 months old, so I never knew him, obviously. But I found out when I was an early teenager, when I was starting to get into Edgar Allan Poe, that was my grandfather's favorite author
Mm.
too. And my grandfather would come home from work, and he was a bit of an alcoholic, and he would go straight to the pub and drink all night long, and then come home completely intoxicated, and then make my dad's oldest sister read him Edgar Allan Poe while he fell asleep every night in the rocking chair. And I never knew that Poe had such an impact on my grandfather, and I often wondered if that was another correlation as to why I was such a fan of Poe's work. Subconsciously, I inherited the love for Poe from my grandfather. And then years later to find myself in his hometown and to be able to sit at his bar and have a pint and go to his home. And, there's just so many weird circumstances. And then when Neverlasting was released, I don't think that I realized how inspired by Edgar Allan Poe I've been. But then after Neverlasting was released, TE Magazine from the UK held it as the modern day Edgar Allan Poe. And I'm like, there's only one Poe. I'm not trying to emulate him. Maybe his influence is very strong as far as, but it was never something that I meant to intentionally seek to be. He just really influenced my writing a lot when I was formidable when I was 11 and 12 years old. So
If he could see you now, what do you think your grandfather would think of your career?
I think he would be. I think he'd be proud. I do still have one grandfather that's alive. Thank God. My grandfather George. He's 91 now, and he bought Noctambulist and he bought Neverlasting, and he's just extremely proud of everything that I've been able to accomplish over the time. So I would like to think that my grandfather Ellenberger would also be proud, especially with my love for Poe.
Not that you want to compromise your vision, but do you think now with Noctambulist, that's more of a vintage look rather than a horror look, it is a little bit more accessible to your family and to people who aren't immersed in the goth and alternative culture? Do you think you're kind of throwing them a bone and giving them a meeting ground?
Well, first and foremost, I do it for myself, but that was a thought too with Noctambulist, is that this is something that my family should be able to enjoy for the most part. But see, I've never been a gory filmmaker. I've never been a gory storyteller. I've always been really intrigued by psychological terror, which obviously, being a fan of Edgar Allan Poe's work, that's what he thrived on, was the psychological horror. So I would rather, and I've always been into psychology. So, what causes someone, or what constitutes somebody as being sane or insane, and when do they cross the line? What's their breaking point that makes them snap? And so I've always, as a writer, been more intrigued by the horrors within your own mind and things that you can, maybe that was part of my mental breakdown 2 years ago. It was all things that were completely made up in my own mind that drove me to the brink of insanity. And I would, and I think it would be safe to say that from here on out, the majority of my films are always going to tend to be more of a psychological thriller than a blood and spatter, horror type film. Psychological horror films are more my niche.
Well, talking about Poe, it reminds me, I think my favorite is The Telltale Heart, one of his short stories, which is all about a man with extreme paranoia, extreme anxiety. Is that, do you think, the story you most connect with of all of Poe's?
Honestly, I would say no. I think for me, because it's the first Poe story that I've ever read, was The Black Cat. And I'm an animal lover and I'm a cat lover. And the first short story that I read was The Black Cat, probably at age 11, maybe even 10. And, he was also driven mad, and, the cat didn't help matters in that story. But for me, I guess, because it was my first Poe, my introduction to Poe, that will always be my favorite.
When you were young.
But I can't.
Yeah, what were the movies that influenced you the most when you were young?
It was all the early black and white films. Growing up in the early 70s, my father would come home from work, and it wasn't just horror, but my dad did like, horror or shows or films that could fall into that subcategory. My dad would come home from work and we would either watch The Honeymooners or Abbott and Costello, which I love, the Abbott and Costello Meet the Wolfman and The Mummy and Meet Frankenstein and all of those. Or we would watch, Night Gallery with Rod Serling, or later The Twilight Zone or Alfred Hitchcock. And then, of course, he would watch The Munsters and The Addams Family. But then, we'd go back and watch The Marx Brothers. So everything that I grew up loving and admiring were all the old black and white, TV shows or films. And, probably the first movie that I really fell in love with was Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. That was probably the first film that comes to mind that I was just really intrigued by. So I guess transforming from the heavily tattooed punk look to where I'm at today, it was a pretty easy transformation because, again, it was always there. I just was expressing myself outwardly much differently than today.
Well, it seems like part of that was memorable for you is that you watched that with your dad. It seems pretty special that your dad would take the time to watch, all this with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And still to this day, there's nothing better than, my father and I love the same type of music, the same type of movies. And even if we don't have anything else to talk about, we can just chat about films and music, which is normally what we do talk about. So, he was such a huge influence on my love for the arts. And, I have a wood burning company that I do on the side when I'm not filming. And, my father dabbles in wood burning and folk art. So, all my
Mhm.
love for the arts comes from my father. So it's very
Mhm.
special.
Does your wife share your taste in movies?
She does. Not everything, but she loves, um, the old timey films that I like, and she likes horror. And, we agree on most half of the same music also. She would say I'm much more particular than she is. I'm very turn my nose up at things. He's like, oh, I don't like that, but she does also like everything else that I enjoy, which makes it easy. So
Now, you said you modeled together. Did she also act in your films?
she has. I had to throw her in just as an extra in Noctambulist. There's a scene which one of the scenes near the beginning, the lead actress Zella, which was played by Lauren Pill, she's in this dream. It's the very first dream sequence of the film, and she's walking through this field where there's cloaked figures with fires burning and smoke, and people bleeding from the eyes, wearing nursing gowns. And it was actually inspired. That was actually inspired by the book of Dante.
Mm.
Dante's Inferno is one of the first stories I read also as a child, and I just always loved the imagery that conjured. So that was kind of inspired, that scene, by the book of Dante. And she's actually one of the very first, I guess, patients walking into frame, bleeding from the eyes and like coughing up matter and so forth.
And that's pretty nice, though,
Um,
that even if she's not, the lead or, the major force in the movie, that she can just be around you to see what you're so, obsessed with. I mean, this is your world. It's hard to describe that to some people if they're not on set or not involved. I mean, do you think it just helps with a shorthand, like she knows exactly what it takes to do what you do?
I tell you, I've never had anybody be more supportive, which is really what you need.
Yeah.
If you don't, if you're in a serious relationship, whether it's just you're dating seriously or you're married or engaged, if you don't have a partner who is behind you 110%, you're not going to make it. Either you're not going to make it film or your relationship's going to fall apart, which has happened to me in the past. I've lost numerous relationships because of my work and my drive to create. But she 150% behind me at all times, whether it's just giving me advice or helping me to procure an item. If I'm short financially, she'll say, let me pick this up for you. Not you can get me back at a later date or whatever the case may be. Or even with Noctambulist, I drove myself nuts. That film was screened by one of our mutual friends at the Worldcon 75 Film Festival, and uh, they didn't see the director's cut. They saw probably a cut, one or two versions before the final director's cut, because I spent probably 2 years editing that film.
Mhm.
And I would say, no, it's not right. I need to go back and redo it, or I need to change the music here because it was a silent film. I really needed to make sure that all the music was so appropriate. And so I changed the music. And I mean, after 2 years, there were so many times where my fiance would just walk into the room and she's like, honey, it is perfect the way it is. Like you need, and I think that's one of the biggest fears for us artists is that our work are our children. And sometimes it's scary to let your adult child leave the nest and go out into the real world for the first time. And I think that's
Mhm.
what I was having with Noctambulist is I couldn't bring myself to let it go. And I kept tinkering with it for the longest time. And finally she had to sit me down. She's like, look, I'm 100% honest with you.
Mhm.
If there was something I didn't like, I would tell you to change it.
Yeah.
But it is perfect the way it is, and you have to just let it go. And so, if it wasn't for her and her support and her advice, and just being just so supportive, that's all I could say is that it's really made a big difference in my work.
Mhm.
So I can't thank her enough for that.
Well, I just want to ask you a few more things about Noctambulist, then move on
Yeah,
to your new project.
sure.
So, Noctambulist got picked up. You have a distributor. It's out there on home video. What's been just, the best feedback you've received so far about it?
Oh boy, there's been so much feedback. I would say the more recent feedback was I was on a podcast from Canada, based out of Canada, probably 2 or 3 months ago, and it was a gentleman by the name of Mickey McKenna and his co-host. And the whole interview, man, she just gushed about how much she loved Noctambulist and how the production value looked like it was so much higher than what I actually spent on the film, and she couldn't believe the acting and how I was able to direct my actors without any dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how did you get them to convey the imagery on their faces and make sure that everything was just so pronounced to deliver the story? And you know, I've had other people that have never watched the silent film that watched Noctambulist just because they were curious to see what somebody like me would do with it. And you know, they were like, "Wow, you know, this is really impressive. Like now I have to go back and check out films that influenced you, which were, you know, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and The Phantom Carriage and so many of the great early silents." So for somebody to say that they enjoyed my work enough to go back and check out, you know, the films that inspired me,
Mm-hmm.
that's hugely monumental. And then, you know, I would say as a director and as a cinematographer, well, I've had a couple people tell me that they cried at the end.
Mm-hmm.
That was definitely one of the biggest. When I've had a couple radio show hosts tell me, like, at the ending, we cried. And to be able to move somebody to the point that you bring them to tears is the best compliment.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one, I've had a couple people tell me that my style of filmmaking is very European, which I appreciated because I've never bought into the 1 minute page equals 1 minute on screen aspect, because you know, the way that European cinematography is so much more detailed and it pays attention to everything, even if it might not be a focal point in that particular scene. They might focus on it for a moment just because it encompasses the entire set and scenery. And that's the way that I really got with Noctambulist. I was, you know, the pacing was quicker. The pacing was more modern with Noctambulist than you would get from an early 1900s film. But I still think that I stayed true to that era by the cinematography and the fact that some of the scenes are a little bit drawn out, which, you know, some people love. I mean, I know Quentin Tarantino got a lot of shit for scenes like Reservoir Dogs at the opening diner scene when, you know, it was just stationary camera set on everybody having a discussion at the diner, and people are like, oh, but he can get away with that. And that's, I love those types of films. You know, I can sit through a slower paced film. And
What was that movie from a couple of
maybe
years ago that won all the Oscars? It was a silent film, and it was black and white. It wasn't that long.
the more recent one I could think of was The Lighthouse.
No, this was a couple of years before that. I think, was it French? I don't know. Anyways,
I think you might be right.
I can't remember, but that it was, you were talking about introducing people to silent films. There really are a lot of people who have never seen a silent film, and I think for a lot of people when that came out, that may have been their first one. And when you kind of get hooked and think, wow, that's its own special way of telling a story, you know, silently. And it seems like you use that frees you up when you're not recording sound on set to really focus on the visual. I'm just curious, for you as a filmmaker, how did that let you really work on your visuals?
Well, I tell you what, I got to approach it from a whole different aspect than being a film director. I got to basically approach the film as a choreographer. You know, there's a lot of scenes where I think that if people watched it and maybe didn't pick up on it the first time around, but go back for a second or third watch, I try to approach that film like a ballet. Like just a lot of the way that I had the characters move, you know, are very reminiscent of a ballerina, you know, or a ballet dancer. And I think that there are certain scenes that just really pull that out. You know, I've had some people tell me that the film looks like it's a moving picture, like an artistic picture that came to life. And that was a huge honor because that's how I tried to approach the film. And so by not relying on audio, I got to rely on body language, which is so important to me. I mean, even when I work on a film with dialogue, you know, the body language is key to everything in a film. And so that really just working on a silent film really let me focus on that. And I think it just made it more artistic because it has a ballet type feel to the picture. And, you know, obviously I love music. So it was really a lot of fun to pick and choose and write some of the music for those scenes to make it flow that way.
You also had a theme of, you know, jealousy, infidelity. Mm-hmm. What was it like to explore that?
It It was great for me. I mean, I've always loved that, but I mean that goes back to the old noir storylines, you know. Um, any of the great detective movies from the 1940s and 50s, you know, they all revolved around this love triangle and somebody betraying one. So I've always loved, you know, those types of stories. Any of the stories that were published in the Black Mask magazine that was really famous in the 40s, um, those crime noir detective thrillers. But I would have to say it was probably a little uncomfortable for my actors at times. Nicholas Nazario, who played Stellan, and then his love interest that wasn't his wife, um, Nadia White. I don't think she was as uncomfortable because she actually comes from a world where she does professional pornography. So she comes from a whole, and she actually has acted in quite a good bit of B horror films. But her main, her main job is she's a porn actress. And for Nicholas, I think he was and the fact that he was married at the time, I think it made him really uncomfortable to be involved with implied love scenes. Which I admit, if I was in his shoes, I would have been uncomfortable also. But it was really neat for a director because that challenged me, you know, trying to make sure that they were both comfortable with one another and, trying to, I don't know, it was just, it was a lot of fun to play with that storyline. And
Hmm.
that, again, revolves around a lot of the stories that I read growing up with, the detective novels.
Do you think as you move forward in your writing, you'll approach more personal issues in your stories or things that, are running through your mind? Like,
Well, actually, the whole plot, not to interrupt, that actually is very personal to me. That's actually kind of happened in my life in the past, not
hmm
obviously in my present relationship, but almost every relationship I've been in has had some type of betrayal or some type of crazy thing happen. And so that definitely that story probably hits home more than people realize. And yeah, I mean, most of the films down to the one that I'm working on next, which has to do again with mental illness to a point, hits very close to home for me also too. So I think that you have to. I think that when you're writing a script, and that's one reason why I like to direct my own scripts as opposed to just directing something that somebody else has written. I like to be emotionally invested in all the stories. And I feel like even if it's uncomfortable, you have to give a part of yourself to the script to make it real and to make it sincere. And if you don't do that, and I think that was my problem when I first started making movies, you know, Caustic Zombies was just some script that didn't appeal to me. Like, not that it didn't appeal to me, but it wasn't to me. There was nothing personal in it, and I didn't know what direction I wanted to go. And I think at the time I was writing a script that I thought just it was what other people wanted to see. And, once I figured out that I need to be more involved with the personal aspects of writing the script, and that happened with Noctambulist, and it will continue. I just think that helped things go to the next level.
what does it do to your writing when you shift it to your own personal fears as opposed to a zombie fear, now that you're actually tackling something that could potentially happen to you?
Yeah, I mean, my writing's definitely much more rewarding. It actually harkens back to my writing when I was an early teen. Believe it or not, I've lost almost everything that I've ever had in my life, from clothes and furniture to knickknacks, just because of constant moves and you lose things over the years. But the one thing that I never lost was my first notebook that I ever started writing in, as far as poetry and short stories. And in fact, probably a week or two ago, I went back. I had come across it in my study and was going back, and I thought to myself, you know what? There are some things now that I'm much older that I would tweak just little words here or there. But for the most part, I would feel almost comfortable enough to take all those early writings and have them published to this day. And so I think that, my writing was very deep and personal as a young teenager. And then I just didn't have any focus when I got into film, and I was trying to write things that other people wanted to see. And then I rediscovered myself, and I think I go back to the earlier me that was enthused about writing, that felt that it was therapeutic, and felt that it was just something that I don't know. It's much different when you put yourself into it, but to me that's the only way that I've ever known how to write. And when I've tried to write differently, it's never worked.
Before we move on to something new, tell me one funny anecdote from the set of Noctambulist.
Mm. I would say probably when we were filming, there's a scene where, well, there's a scene where we referenced the car twice. But at the time, even though I had, the cameras and the lights and everything like that, I didn't have any way to fasten the camera to the hood of the car. So my whole aspect of filmmaking is do whatever it takes to get the job done. So I fearlessly just jump onto the hood of the car with my camera and told Nicholas to gas it, and we went flying down the road while I'm hanging on the hood with the camera in one hand filming. And they're like, "You're just such a nut." And but I mean, to me, that's what I needed to do to make sure that I got the shot. And so that was a comical, but we had a lot of fun on that set, and that's the way most of my sets are. They're very serious and story and subject matter, but we have a lot of fun on and off set. And the house of Noctambulist that we filmed in was actually haunted, and we actually did have some haunting experiences.
Well, besides
I was actually forewarned.
being afraid of falling
What's
off
that?
the car, the hood can get really hot. They get really hot when you're
Uh-huh.
on top of it, especially an old car like
Yeah,
that.
and I was dressed in my three-piece suit, and I was on the 1921 Model T, and it's just sheet metal, and I was burning up, and
Probably
I did what I had
vibrating.
to. Luckily,
Probably wasn't the smoothest ride either. Camera shaking.
no, luckily in editing, I was able to stabilize the camera in post-production so that it wasn't shaking all over the place. But yeah, and we were going down a gravel road at that, so the car's bumping, and you didn't have the shock system like they have on cars nowadays, so it was like super rough compared to the cars of nowadays. So
So the guy that let you use his car, did he watch the movie?
you know what? I would like to know if he did. I After we were done filming, I lost contact with him, and I didn't mean to. In fact, I wanted to buy the car off of him. But because we had met through Facebook, and so many people are on Facebook for a short time and they delete their account or whatever, like I somehow lost correspondence with the guy, and I didn't have his number anymore. And I keep wondering, I'm like, man, I would love to. First of all, I would like to own the car because I love it. Secondly, I would like to own it because it was in the film. And thirdly, I would like to know, if he had an opportunity. I don't even know at the time if he even knew what the name of the film was. He was an older guy that was just like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to show up, going to drop it off, and just give me a call when it's done, and I'll have my wife bring me down to pick it up. So I don't even know if he ever knew the name of the film. But I'm definitely appreciative that he let us use it, and I'm super curious to see if he had ever seen it.
All right, before we talk about your new project, you are going to be in an upcoming documentary, Canadian,
Mhm.
made by a Canadian director called, and I'm reading it here, Love to be Scared.
Yes, sir.
How did that all come about?
Uh, well, the writer and director of the documentary, Mickey McKenna, he's actually the one podcaster that I had mentioned about that highly praised Noctambulist. So I think that he became familiar with me through that. And then he sent me a friend request on Facebook, and he's been super supportive the past couple months and asked if I would be involved with this documentary, which is based on my favorite topic, which is psychological horror, and why people are driven to like horror movies while other people are turned off by horror films. And so I just love the premise of the documentary to discuss, the psychology behind horror films, why you make them, why you watch them, why you love them, what you might not love about them. And so I did the interview and filmed my segment. Obviously, with the pandemic and him being in Canada, we filmed everything remotely.
That probably
Um,
helps the
and that
budget.
was probably, it helps the budget for sure. And luckily, we didn't run into any technical glitches with that. And to the best of my knowledge, the movie is coming out. I know he got the discs back.
Mhm.
They're going to be available on DVD. I think he's doing a short run release on VHS, which is pretty cool. And today's the 13th. I do believe, and I hope I'm not misspeaking, but I think the DVD goes on sale tomorrow,
That's
February 14th.
exciting.
So
Well, I imagine he asked you what scares you and what was unearthed. Like, I mean, why do you like to be scared? Why do you like to watch a scary movie?
again, it goes back to, the psychological terrors. And that's something that, I think the reason why that appeals to me is, unlike, even though obviously as a young age in the 80s, I loved the slasher films, you know, Michael Myers and Jason and Freddy and all that. That's great. But the thing I love most about psychological horrors is a lot of times, especially if it's a horror within, you can't get away from it, man. Like, you can outrun the boogeyman, you know, or if somebody's trying to intrude on your home and kill you, you know, you can fight them off. But, you know, the horrors that go on within one's mind, sometimes those are unshakable. And so that's why I'm drawn to psychological thrillers and horrors, and why people act the way they do in certain situations and how that affects them.
In real life, what personally frightens you the most?
I would have to say this is very contradictory of my behavior, since I'm a hermit and a recluse. But I would say probably my biggest fear is being alone, would be my biggest fear. I don't necessarily need to be out in public and be out in the world, but the fear of not having that special loved one by your side. You know, I think that just having psychological issues to begin with, and then not having somebody there beside you that can work you through it and be there beside you, is really terrifying, because when you're left to your own devices, it could be quite scary. So I would say loneliness.
Loneliness
And abandonment.
Well, this is all about you, Johnny, but it makes me think, I have a weird fear. Tell me what you think of this. Psychoanalyze me. I have this weird fear of accidentally hitting someone while I'm driving a car. You know, it's like you look away for a minute and you don't see someone crossing the sidewalk, then you hit them. For just some reason, I have this fear of that, and like that would be the most horrible feeling in the world to do that, because it happens so quickly, a split second, and you really can't take it back.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I could see that being terrifying. My cousin accidentally hit somebody once with his vehicle. It wasn't his fault, but he was driving down the road doing a speed limit. It had just turned nighttime, and there was a gentleman walking to a funeral home, of all places, dressed in all black, and just walked right out without looking. And my cousin hit him. And luckily, the guy didn't die. But yeah, I mean, that could be terrifying. Loss of control, or having something happen to you beyond your means of control, would also, you know, be very terrifying.
Wasn't that the plot of I Know What You Did Last Summer, when the high school kids run the guy down and leave him there or something?
I've seen that movie, but it wasn't necessarily my cup of tea, and that was so long ago. What was that, like 96 or something? So I don't remember that so well, but it sounds like it probably could have been the premise to the story. But I could see that being, you know, terrifying. You know, I'm a bit of a control freak on top of everything else, so I can see why that would be terrifying.
And what was just the most pointed question you were asked for Love to Be Scared? Do you just remember in particular one moment when he's interviewing you of something that made you a little uncomfortable?
Oh boy, I would have to go back and revisit those questions now. I'm a bit hazy on that because it was a couple months ago that I did it. That's why I'm actually looking forward to seeing the movie when it comes out, because I don't even recall all the questions or my answers. And, you know, I'm sure I'll be critiquing myself saying, boy, I wish I could have said that better, or, you know, but so offhand, I can't think anything.
Did he ask you what movie scared you the most when you were a kid?
I don't know if he did. But the movie that scared me, which, see, here's the thing, and I'm not saying this to be super cool, but I don't get scared at all very easily, not as an adult. You know, my fiance, on the other hand, if I walk into the kitchen, I don't know if I have soft feet or what, and she doesn't hear me coming, but I scare the crap out of her all the time. She jumps at everything. If the cats knock something over, she jumps out of her skin. Oh my God. I can go through a haunted house or watch a movie or anything in the world, and nothing makes me jump, which I'm envious, because I wish that I could. I wish that I could get scared, because it's so much fun when you are. But as a child, the film that had the biggest impact as far as scaring me was Jaws. And I know a lot of people don't think of Jaws as a horror film, but it truly, truly is. And I remember watching Jaws and not being able to let my feet dangle over the edge of my bed when it was over. because I was so young and I thought Jaws was like under my bed. And if I had my feet hanging over the edge, he would come up from underneath of my bed and bite my feet off. Maybe that's because I watched Saturday Night Live too with Land Shark. And I'm like, sharks can live on water. But yeah, that was probably the only film that actually terrified me. And it's absurd to be terrified by that, at least in the way that I was as a child. But,
So you think that might be coming out tomorrow? Do you know if that's going to be streaming or just on DVD, or how's that coming out?
I don't know. I'll have to talk to Mickey about that. I've been helping him a lot behind the scenes, just giving him advice. And actually, you had asked today before the show if he had a trailer. So I messaged him. I'm like, look, it's your movie. I don't want to tell you what to do, but you should probably cut a trailer together or two because it gives the press something to sink their teeth into. And, I kind of been just coaching him and steering him along the way. And right now, he's only self-distributing the film too. So anybody that's out there that wants to get their hands on Love to Be Scared, look up Mickey McKenna on Facebook and add him. And
From Canada.
From Canada. And I do know that there are there's some movie stores in Canada that are selling his movie, but obviously those for the rest of us that aren't able to drive to Canada and go into one of those stores, you can contact him. He'll mail you a copy. But I would like to see him get it on Amazon, at least for, Amazon Prime or whatnot.
It's funny you mentioned friending him on Facebook. When I want to interview someone on my podcast, I will often Facebook friend them, because if you just send them a message through Messenger and you're not a friend, a lot of times it doesn't get to them. So it's like I friend them first just so I know that my message will get to them. But I'm always afraid they'll say, who is this? Why does he want to be my friend? We're not friends. So I almost feel like I overuse Facebook friending because I know, we're not going to be interactive friends. I just want to get a message to them. And it's so hard to get people's email addresses nowadays. Do you ever feel like that? Like,
it is. And a lot of people scream.
Yeah. Do you ever feel like you want to get in touch with people? Like, do you have a good go-to method if you're trying to get through to someone online?
No, I really don't. I'm terrible. You and I have known each other for quite some time, ever since I was doing the documentary Blood on the Reel. And we hit it off and became great friends, like almost instantaneously. And I often think about you and what you're up to. But you know what? I am so bad at keeping up with people on Facebook. And there's no excuse for it, but I just, Facebook has become, and all social media in general, has just become a place for so much hate and divisiveness that I literally, for probably the past year or two, only go onto Facebook to check my messages and to make a post, and then I'm back off again. So I miss mostly everything that the people that I do care about. I miss what they're doing because I just can't stand to spend any time on social media. And I don't think that that's good for a lot of people with, there's mental health, whether it's perfect or whether they have some issues. It can be very depressing or very aggravating. So I just try to stay off it. And it doesn't mean that I don't care about people. Like, I was so excited when you invited me onto the show. I'm like, yay, I love Kelly. He's awesome. But, we hadn't talked in ages, but it wasn't for any particular reason other than the fact that I just don't spend a lot of time, on social media and that's the problem with being an independent filmmaker. Is that even though I have a distribution deal, which I'm thankful for, and I love SGL Entertainment, is that in the indie world, you're still expected to promote yourself around the clock. And what I find daunting about that is, how am I going to create something new if I'm wasting precious time promoting something that I've already released just so people know about it?
Yeah.
So it's this dichotomy. It's like, do I promote what just came out, or do I hope that people find it and focus my attention on the next project? So yeah, I don't really spend a lot of time online or social media, which is probably detrimental to a lot of people finding out about me. But that's why I do like to do these podcasts with people when I can.
Well, what I'm finding is, social media can be all-consuming. It can just, hours and hours of it, of your day wasted. But what I'm finding though, when you know someone like a JD Ellenberger, that's a shortcut, because I can say, hey, I'm looking for a guest on my podcast. Who can you directly recommend? And I think increasingly in the indie film community, when you latch on to a couple people that you have rapport with, word of mouth is so important. Beyond social media, you almost want to say, hey, hey, Johnny, who are some cool people? Who are some cool, dependable people that you can refer directly to me?
And I love that. I may be a hermit and I may not get to speak to people often online, but I love referring my friends and getting them involved and giving other people advice. And, we're all in it together. That's the way I look at it. There's no competitiveness. There shouldn't be. If Kelly Hughes makes a fantastic movie, I want to be inspired by it. And I want him to set the bar for me to be able to raise my bar the next time that I make a movie. And it's friendly competition and excitement towards one another. So I love when people can unite instead of petty bickering and being out for themselves. I absolutely love helping others, whether it's to just get on a show or give them advice or to help them, find another film to work on. And
well, who
that's
knows?
what it should be
Maybe I'll
about.
have you look up the Canadian director of Love to Be Scared and say, hey, I think Kelly wants you to be on his podcast.
Yeah. Well, Mickey's already familiar with your show. I've already told him about
Well,
you,
there you
actually.
see. Now I don't have to go
So,
through the whole artificial Facebook friend request kind of
yeah.
thing. Wait 3 weeks, see if he got it, and blah blah
Yeah.
blah. I'll either get a quick yes or a
And
no.
I've actually, exactly. And I've already, I've already told him that I was coming on today because I asked him if he had the trailer. And then when we're done with today's show, I'll just put another little bug in his ear and be like, hey, by the way, Kelly mentioned he'd like to get you on. So if you get a friend request from him,
Excellent.
don't think he's some creep.
And that's the other thing is it's fun to get a constant stream of new people. You want to like your old friends and people you already know and trust, but that's part of what keeps things fresh is you do want to hear from new talent. You do want to be, re-inspired by new people every now and then. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, so many people inspire me in one way or another, even if it's just to motivate me to go above and beyond with my next film. And that's what I love about camaraderie and, all the filmmakers such as yourself that I've been able to meet over these years. There's definitely more positivity than not. Every now and again, you'll find somebody that's a little bit too stuck on themselves, but for the most part, everybody's pretty humble and willing to help one another out. And
or you find someone like you that makes a pre-podcast poster to promote it. That was pretty darn
oh, I
special.
love doing that. I love doing that, and I can't wait. Once we have all the info for the show to air, I'll go ahead and I'll get it finalized and everything together. But that's what I love is helping others out, and I've actually become known in the circle of podcasters and stuff. People will be like, "Hey, I hear that when you're on a show, you make really cool flyers for it. Would you make one for our
Mhm.
show that you're on?" And I'll gladly do it. Just anything that I can to help out in any way, whether it's significant or relatively minor.
Well, especially nowadays when artist and promoter, the line blurs because a lot of people wear many hats. And even if you're a filmmaker, at some point you might be a podcaster interviewing other filmmakers. And maybe it's just this big mutual admiration society. But that's not a bad thing. I mean, it is nice that
Yeah.
we can, I think we have more empathy because we can be on both sides depending on, maybe we're in between projects, so we're promoting someone else. And then when we got a project to promote, maybe we've created enough goodwill with other people that they'll say, yeah, I want to promote you because you've done so much for me.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm definitely not intentionally name dropping on here for the name drop's sake, but when I first got into filmmaking and I was working with Caustic Zombies, and I hail from the Pittsburgh area, home of George Romero and Night of the Living Dead, and George Romero's son is a tattoo artist who opened up a tattoo shop like a half hour from where I was living at the
Oh,
time.
wow.
And for the grand opening of the tattoo shop, Romero stopped by. Him and Tom Savini, they were there for the grand opening,
And
and they
Savini
did a meet
too?
and greet with and Tom Savini,
Wow.
yeah. Um, so I actually got to sit down with George one on one for about an hour, just the two of us. And I told him about how appreciative I was of his work and how much, he inspired me. And, coming from the Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh area, Night of the Living Dead is like monumental. Everybody has seen it, everybody loves it, everybody takes pride that it's from their hometown. And I tell you what, the hour to maybe hour and a half that we just sat talking, and he gave me a ton of advice and listened to me, tell him how much I admired him. The most humble, gracious human being that you could ever want to meet. And I would congratulate him or tell him that I admired something, and he would literally blush. His face would turn beet red in front of me, and he would go, "Oh, come on, like please don't." And like, greatest human. And then like a year later, I met him at a convention in Upper Pennsylvania. We were somewhere, and there was a line around the table to meet him. It was like probably a 2-hour long line to meet Romero. And my fiance said, "Hey, do you want to go over and say hi to George?" And I said, "I've already met him. We've hung out for an hour and a half intimately, having a wonderful conversation. I don't want to interrupt him." And so I just kind of kept going. And all of a sudden I hear, "Hey, Johnny Daggers." And I turn around, and it's George calling me from his table. He had remembered me and was waving at me and telling me to, "Hey, come on." So, I mean, when you meet somebody like that, it's just so humble and just such a kind human being, you want to emulate that kindness when you're in a position of becoming a filmmaker. And so, again, I don't bring George up to name drop, but what I bring him up for is the fact that he taught me a lot about humility and a lot about kindness and a lot about respect, and never being too busy to take the time to give advice to somebody. And so I try now, God rest his soul, we don't have George anymore, but I try to carry that with me on a daily basis. So
I think we're also reminded that our idols aren't going to live forever. And, you know, when we do have the chance at a convention or however, you know, those are special times. We don't always get a second chance to meet those people. Yeah. Sounds like you really take advantage of that, and, you know, you seize those opportunities.
I was blessed in that aspect of having a chance to meet him several times. But, you know, it also could be the morbid side of me where I'm always so worried about, you know, whether we're going to be here tomorrow or not. In this pandemic, you would think I'd be out of my mind because my type of personality, you would think. But I tell you what, for whatever reason, and I've read multiple reports where they say that people that are into horror films are having a better time adapting and coping with the pandemic than those who aren't into horror. And there has to be some type of validity to that. But I'm always thinking like, and I think that's why I work around the clock, because my thing is if I die tomorrow, you know, I want to say that I've done it all without any regrets, but I want to put out as much work as possible so that people remember me. I think that's another one of my biggest fears, is being forgotten. So not only to digress and go back to your other question, being alone and abandoned, and a very close tie with that is being forgotten, because they're kind of you know, sympathetic that way. So you know, I try to live every day the best that I can, and when I do have opportunity, I try to make the best of it. So, and I should probably take my advice and get out there and do it more often, but baby steps. So, but I do try to make the best of the times that I have.
Well, whether it's a director, a writer, or even a musician, which of your idols would you still like to meet?
Everybody's dead.
Yeah.
That sounds so terrible, but like literally everybody that I would love to meet. I mean, I did fanzines and music magazines for over a decade, and when it comes to that, you know, my favorite band of all time being The Cure, and getting to meet Robert Smith and hang out with him in the green room for like 6 hours while he played Texas Hold'em. And I probably shouldn't say this, but he ended up losing like $30,000 or $40,000 in one hand of Texas Hold'em to his roadie. And wow. It was just like, wow. And I'm like, I'm here with like Robert Smith, and, you know, 6 hours. They actually had to kick us out because we had overstayed so long in the not the hotel, but the music venue. Like, their employees wanted to clean up and go home. And they're like, "Okay, guys, you finally have to wrap this up. We need to clean up and go home." But that was so huge. But I mean, you know, as far as so many of my musicians, I mean, I love the blues, I love jazz, I love swing. All these people that I would have loved to have met if I had been alive back then, they're all gone now. And, you know, I would have loved to have sat down with Alfred Hitchcock or Rod Serling and talked to them, or, you know, Fritz Lang, you know, any of those guys would have been so great.
Metropolis.
So, and now that I'm old,
Metropolis.
Oh, most certainly. One of my all-time favorites.
You could ask him what inspired Metropolis. That's interesting. You pick a silent movie director. I mean, that would have been amazing, because that's still, I would think that would be one of your informative movies, your all-time favorites.
Yeah, most certainly. It's on the list. I didn't mention it earlier, but Metropolis is definitely one of my top 5. silent films that really, I mean, just it's so beautiful. It's the cinematography on that's gorgeous. But and then the thing is I often get asked that question, and I don't mean this in an arrogant way at all. But like, I don't have heroes as an adult like I did as a child and as a younger adult. I did. Nowadays, I see people as people. So, if George Romero were still alive to this day, for example, and somebody's like, hey, you want to go over and hang out with George, I wouldn't be starstruck. I would treat him just like a normal human being. And just be like, hey, man, how are you? And pretty nonchalant about it. So as far as the living people, I get more excited about the people that are no longer with us, because the normal people, they're just people. And,
or sometimes maybe the not quite so well-known people. Maybe there's like a underground cult figure that not everyone knows about, but to you, they're so special.
Those are always the people. Yeah, those are always the people that I've cared about meeting the most, the obscure. So,
Well, I think that's healthy to not, fawn over celebrities. But at a certain point, you're their colleague. You may not be a household name or, make the gigantic salaries that certain people do, but you're still a colleague. And it's hard to like fawn or grovel to think, no, I'll give them their respect, for their, they have stature in show business, but at the same time, I have some self-respect too. There's no reason that I can't deal with even an idol, on a 50-50 basis.
Yeah. Yeah, most certainly. Yeah. I mean, my experience and interactions with, said celebrities, whether they're B or not, 99% of the interactions have been absolutely fantastic, and they're just normal human beings. And every now and again, you get that one miserable person that tells you to screw off and go away. And it's like, well, and then that ruins, at least for me, I can't watch their films anymore. I've only ever happened to me that once, and I won't say the actor's name, but I can't. He used to be one of my favorite actors. Now I can never watch one of his films. But for the most part, all interactions are really cool.
I think the sweetest celebrity I ever met was the actress who played Marilyn on the Munsters. She was so gracious. Cool. But
I've never.
I was going to say, though, speaking of, and then we're going to move on because we have to talk about your new project, but I would like to see you get, after COVID and all this, get back into some of the conventions. Could you see yourself, getting out there and meeting your public again?
Some.
What would it take, do you think, for you to do that?
I don't know. It would take a lot of coercing. I mean, because my thing about it is I would agree, and then I wouldn't back out. But let's say the convention was 3 months away, and they're like, Johnny, would like to have you as a guest at our convention. Will you do it? Okay. For 3 months, I'm going to fret every single day about how bad I'm dreading to go, going to this convention to see people and to be
really. It would be that much for you.
Day. Oh, it'd be that daunting.
Wow.
Yeah, it would be that daunting. And even the car ride there would be that daunting. But as my fiance always says, is once I get there, she's like, you're a completely different person. She's like, you're jovial, you open up, you're personable, you're actually, instead of, hiding and cowering in the corner, you're talking to everybody that you could possibly speak to. Mm-hmm. It's just pushing me out the door, getting me into the car, and then getting me to the location of the convention. And then once I'm there, I can, then I'm like, oh, that was really silly of me to be terrified of this.
But leading up to it, when you're worrying about it, what's like the worst case scenario that you're fearful of?
Just being around people.
But what will those people do? You think it'll be embarrassing? You think you just won't know what to say? I mean, what's the core fear?
Well, see, when we did conventions in the past, which, when I was with my ex-Dagger Vision partner, Brian, we attended a lot of conventions, and it worked out really good for us because I'm not the type of person, again, another contradiction here. I'm not one to be able to stand behind the booth all day and wait for people to come up and buy DVDs. I'd rather be out having a drink at the bar, talking to people, interacting, being the social butterfly. And Brian loved to be behind the booth more often than engaging with the public. So it worked out really good where Brian would man the booth and I would kind of be the social butterfly that would bring people back to the booth and be like, oh, here, come look at my recent work or what we have planned coming up. And then, every now and again when Brian would have to use the restroom or get a bite to eat, I would man the booth and he would go do his thing. So it was really weird dichotomy. It doesn't make any sense. But again, it goes to once I'm there and I'm in the mood, like I can be a social butterfly. I think probably a thing that I just don't like the most about conventions is being stuck behind the booth. So I think I would dread that the most out of everything.
You want to mix and mingle.
Now it's just me. Yeah, I mean, Dagger Vision Films, as I mentioned earlier, has now turned into Seafaring Pictures. So I just think that it's more appropriate with the type of films that I'm making. So if I were to set up with the Seafaring Pictures booth, I don't know, man. It's just me by myself. And I find that I work better by myself than having somebody involved with the... And no offense to Brian, I love Brian and we're still dear friends, but we decided that in order to remain friends, we couldn't be in the same production team anymore. Because when it came down to conventions, I've always tried to handle things like I do now. Sophisticated, look appropriately, try not to cheapen it by any means. And, no offense to him at all. I love him. But, his idea with the last couple of conventions that we did is he wanted to get Dagger Vision girls. And he wanted to get them in little short shorts and exposing skin and draw people to our booths that way. And we really came to blows on that. Because I'm like, I don't make the type of films that sell sex or, that would have girls bring other people to the booth to help sell our films. Mm-hmm. And that was a big problem in our partnership. And it finally got to the point where it's like, okay, you know what? We're not seeing eye to eye on a lot of things. And if we're going to remain friends, we got to go our separate ways. And so, now it's just me going it alone, which means I'm stuck at the booth the entire time. It'd be difficult.
So you just realized you had different aesthetics.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's okay too, like you said. Doesn't mean you have to dislike each other.
Yeah, most certainly. Yeah, we're still close, and he was one of the first people that had me on his podcast or did a review for Noctambulist. So we're still close and we're great friends, even if we don't get to talk as often as I'd like. We just had different ideas about where we wanted to go as a company together. So
speaking of convention fears. One thing I don't like anymore that I used to like? It's panels.
What's that?
Because I went to this point where panels were my favorite thing. Because I just really wanted to hear people talk about their work. But I think it's when you're like on a big panel, like there's 6 people at a table all in a row. Mm-hmm. And it just gets so superficial. No one can really say that much when there's that many people. Yeah. And especially if it's not moderated. A lot of times, like, some blowhard will rise to the surface and dominate 90% of it anyway. So I feel for the people who can't get a word in edgewise. To me, it just becomes frustrating. Or if there's just a lot of giggly, idle chit-chat. It's like, you just want a one-on-one, like a really strong moderator and maybe one speaker or maybe 2 that can, bounce it back and forth. Isn't that funny? Like, the thing I liked the most... Now I kind of dread.
Well, I mean, it's not intimate. And to be perfectly honest with you, the media don't like it either. I mean, all the years that I did my music magazines, I only had to do one interview that was a panel interview. And I hated it. It was with KMFDM. And Raymond Watts from the band Pig opened up for them. So it was like KMFDM and Raymond Watts from Pig. And then maybe some other opening band, like all around this round table. And, we at the media you get a question in here and... Maybe when it's all said and done, you only got to ask 2 or 3 questions and you didn't really get a detailed response because it's a panel and everybody's rushed to get in. So, yeah, I mean, I don't like it as a filmmaker, and I definitely don't like it as a media person. So I don't understand why everybody still likes to do the panel so much. I mean, it's the quickest and easiest way to voice to the masses, I suppose, but it's impersonal. And I don't blame you for not liking it.
The best panel I did, I was a last-minute replacement, and I was doing a lot at this convention. And I think someone dropped out, and this was like one that was at 10 p.m. I'm pretty sure whoever dropped out just wanted to party,
Probably.
And it was a topic I knew nothing about, and I think I had an hour to prepare, and I said, sure. And it turned out to be so fun, I think, in part because there were only a handful of people in the audience. And so it felt very intimate. And the other guy on it, there's just one other guy who was more of the expert, and he was really cool. But I just remember I had an hour or so. I found a computer at the hotel, like they had this little internet thing in the lobby. And the topic was Western horror films. Horror films with a Western theme, which, I said, oh, wow, do they really make
Very
those?
nice.
And I just remember, doing a quick search and, this little cramming for it, like a test. And it was just kind of fun to say, oh, I've got, less than an hour to learn all I can on this one subject, and then pow.
Yeah.
But what I realized was, going into this panel not knowing much, I could just ask the expert, hey, why do you like this? Tell me about it. How did this evolve? Everyone always wants to be the blowhard expert. Sometimes it's nice to have someone go in just wanting to know. Because so often we're all fighting to be, the star, the expert. And I think in these situations, it's so nice to have one person there that just wants to ask you the question.
Yeah, it is. And what a great panel to be on. I love Western horror. This is funny because I don't like to talk about much until it's in the process, because then people expect it to happen. But I've always fantasized about making a Western horror film. And there's a really obscure alternative country band called Slim Cessna's Auto Club that are from Denver, Colorado. They've been around since 97, and I've been a fan of theirs since 97. The funny thing about it is, of all people, Jello Biafra signed them to Alternative Tentacle Records back in 97. So they're no longer with Alternative Tentacle Records, but Jello is the first guy to sign them, and I just absolutely love them. Mm-hmm. And my good friend Phil Lear, who's a talented painter from Colorado, we went to high school together. He says, man, come out here to make a Western. I know the best locations, and I kind of think about having Slim and Munley from Slim Cessna's Auto Club, having them star in the role, have a co-starring role in the film. Or there's an alternative country musician, Sarah Vista from England, from the UK, and I've expressed interest in doing a horror Western with her. So who knows if it'll ever come about, but it's funny that you bring that up as far as the panel, because I would love to do a Western horror.
Yeah, well, I'd love to see you do one too. I think after learning about it, I gained an appreciation of it. And I think in its own ways, like the post-apocalyptic zombie film actually shares a lot with the traditional Western. Especially the idea of the Western frontier, when people, couldn't call 911 to solve a problem. They had to deal with it on their own.
Yeah, most certainly. If you're looking to check one out, there's a really good movie that came out. You might have seen it probably a year ago. I think it's called The Legend of Buster Scruggs, and it's a bunch of shorts. And there's a really good short with Tom Waits in that movie that I absolutely love, where he's mining for gold, and he's out there isolated by himself. And I don't want to give too much away, but if you get a chance to watch it, that was probably my favorite short of that film. But yeah, man,
I could see Tom Waits being in one of your movies, kind of like a stand-in for you.
Oh my God!
Don't you think he could represent your point of view?
Okay, so when I told you that I didn't really have heroes or idolize anybody, if there was one person that I would probably fanboy over to this day, it would be Tom Waits. I just absolutely love the man, and I think that his acting, he doesn't get enough credit for his acting abilities. I think the most memorable, when I was younger, not when I was a kid, but when I was late teens, and I saw him act as Renfield in Dracula, I just could not believe how talented. I had been listening to him for years from my father, but that was the first I really took notice of his acting abilities. And if I could cast Tom Waits, he would be the first person that I would cast.
The Disaster Artist. Wasn't that a black and white film that won the Oscar?
Yeah, he does a lot of black and white. He's in a lot of the Jim Jarmusch movies.
No, but before, when we were talking about that one silent film that won the Oscar a few years ago, wasn't that called The Disaster Artist? I don't think Tom Waits was in it, but it just dawned on me. The Disaster Artist.
I don't know. Now I want to look it up, but I don't want to move. The name sounds so familiar, but I don't know why it's sounding familiar. Maybe I'm confusing it with The Pickup Artist.
The Molly Ringwald movie?
Don't know.
No, but Tom Waits, you're right. I connect him with Jim Jarmusch. And Anyways, I digress.
Yeah, no, I'm still here. Sorry. No, sorry. I was actually trying to pull down my screen without being conspicuous. And see what movie, because I can't think of the silent movie.
I think it was The Disaster Artist.
No,
it wasn't. No, I think that's the one about the making of The Room. I'm getting these mixed up. Anyways, I'll have to look it up. I think the black and white Oscar winner had artist in the title. Anyways, did you like The Room, the movie that they made about the making of The Room?
So here's the funny thing about me, and my fiance picks on me on this all the time. She's like, for a filmmaker and somebody that really loves film, your memory's terrible. Because I am the guy that nowadays Netflix, it used to be the video store, but I will go to Netflix, pick out a movie like, hey, this looks great. We've never seen it. 2 seconds later, oh, I've seen this. Mm-hmm. But I completely forget the title of the movie or, the premise of the film until I start watching it. So offhand, I feel terrible, but I can't remember The Room. And I'm sure I probably have seen it.
When we're done here, we'll both be going to Google to look up all the things. See, this is where if I had Alexa on in the background, but I hate Alexa. I actually got the little box for it for Christmas a couple years ago. And I tried to hook it up. It didn't work. And I thought, you know what? I don't need this in my life. I've got enough devices to keep track of. I don't want to be talking to Alexa.
Yeah.
Does that creep you out? Do you think people are spying on us through
I won't
Alexa?
Use Alexa. Yeah. I think everything is, and not to sound like a crazy nut, but like I will never own an Alexa. I don't want one. I don't like the fact that our smart TVs, I mean, we all know you're having a private conversation about something, and the next thing you know, you go to Facebook and you see 10 ads for it. It's like, well, it's not coincidence. So no. But, I mean, speaking of the movies, and, it makes me feel like an idiot at times, but I just don't remember unless they make a huge impact on me. Like, for instance, the other day, my wife and I are watching TV, and I'm scrolling through Google to check the news about COVID vaccines. And Google's like, the must-see low-budget sci-fi film from 2017. And I'm like, oh, wow, what's this? I got to check it out. Now I can't even remember the name of it. But I'm like, hey, have we seen this? She's like, I don't know. I kind of think we have. And then I'm like, I have no recollection of watching this. So she pulls up the trailer. She's like, yeah. The premise is the one guy's brother belongs to this UFO cult. And then he leaves, but decides to go back to the cult years later. And then he ends up having a UFO encounter. And she's playing the trailer. And she's like, I remember all of this. I know what's happening next. And I look at her and I'm like, I don't remember a single thing of it. I said, did I like it? She says, yeah, you loved it. Or at least I think you liked it. I said, I have no recollection of it. So please forgive me. I don't know if I have the early stages of senility, but there's a lot of things I see that I have no recollection of. So,
well, I guess as you get older, you might have that, but at least you'll become more valuable as a mature male model.
Yeah.
Maybe you can do like a Brooks Brothers campaign or something.
Maybe, and then months later forget that I ever did it.
And then just have total amnesia after that. All right, to wrap up, you promised a scoop. You have a new project that you really haven't told many people about. Can I say the title of it?
You may.
And I hope I pronounce this right. The Lachrymose Primrose. It's very poetic. The
Correct.
Lachrymose Primrose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was never intended to be a film. Firstly, I will say I've been keeping it under wraps just because in the indie world, because things can fall apart so quickly before they ever get started. I hate to get people's hopes up about films. And so I made a promise to myself that I wasn't going to discuss further films until it was pretty much 100% guaranteed that it was going to happen.
You don't want to
jinx it.
Plus,
I think you exhaust a lot of... You don't want to jinx it. You don't want to exhaust the energy. And I thought, how great would it be if I didn't tell anybody that I was working on a new movie until it came out? And then I was just like, boom, here it is. And everybody was like, really? We had no idea he was working on something. But because of the press recently, and we're getting so close, if it wasn't for COVID, would be so close to filming right now. But I decided that, okay, you know what? I do need to publicize this. So your show is really the first that I'm making a big announcement. I briefly spoke about it. Mickey from... the podcast and from Love to Be Scared has a magazine too. And I spoke maybe one sentence about it, but I didn't go into detail. So this is the first show that I'm really expressing it to a lot of people and really going into detail, but it was actually written as a short story. And I had probably finished the short story 3 years ago. And I was supposed to be working on another film, which is called The Art of Defiance, which got completely screwed up because of the pandemic. And there was just no way. It's a big film with a lot of locations and a lot of actors and actresses. And there was just no way that I could do The Art of Defiance right now, which I actually returned to acting in Art of Defiance as the lead actor in that, where I play the life of an artist.
Is this where someone else was directing it?
Nope, I'm writing, directing, and starring in The Art of Defiance, which will be wild for me because I haven't acted in anything since I was on the A&E TV show back in 2014. But that got put on hold because of the pandemic. And I started thinking about an idea. Well, I revisited The Lachrymose Primrose, a short story. And it's the first time that I ever adapted a short story into a feature-length film, which is pretty wild when you think about it. I think the short story was like 6 pages. And now I'm going to adapt this into a feature-length film. So that was challenging. That was the first time I had ever done that. This earbud hates me. But I did. I successfully adapted it into a feature-length script.
And the theme, or the, not theme, but genre, is it another neo-noir? Is it Poe-like? I mean, does it follow Noctambulist style?
It's Poe-like.
Or?
It's Poe-like, and I completely went the opposite direction. In fact, my lead actor in The Lachrymose Primrose, his name's Ted Bodner, he called me up like a week ago, and he's like, you're crazy, man. He's like, you went from doing a black and white film with no sound to making a movie that it's very aesthetic, this next coming film. Not that Noctambulist wasn't. It was in the black and white perspective. But I mean, I'm putting so much focus on color and scenes being painted to match the actor's wardrobe, and like every single detail, like the vase that has the primrose matches the color of the walls, which match some of the patterns on the lead actor's tie, and like everything is just going to be shot very beautifully. And then there's a lot of reliance on sound and a lot of Foley work, which I'm excited to do on this film because I love Foley work. If somebody would hire me to be a Foley artist on one of their films, I would be so excited.
Footsteps and machinery and just recreating all those ambient sounds.
Or voices playing back in the lead character's head, which there's going to be a lot of this, but they're going to get warped and distorted and twisted. And so I get to have so much fun with all of that. I'm just super excited about it. But the film, my cousin Ron probably said it the best. He said it sounds like a very claustrophobic film. And it really is. We're filming in a very, very tiny house so with this pandemic, I had to utilize what I have at my ability. So Art of Defiance had so many locations, which unfortunately some may not be available when the pandemic ends. A lot of small businesses are closing up because, they're going bankrupt, and diners and art galleries that I was scheduled to film in might not be there when this is over. So I needed to refine a film where it has a small script as far as the actors and not many shooting locations. And I think back to films like The Shining, or another one of my favorite movies, The Mist, where it takes place in the convenience store, where it's like 98% was either in the Stanley Hotel or with The Mist in the convenience store, and you only had a tight-knit group of actors that were in the film, and you made something completely tense and terrifying with a small cast, with small locations. So that is what I'm working on with The Lachrymose Primrose.
Well,
so it's only got 2 main actors, Ted Bodner and Michelle Mullins.
Well, I know you don't want to reveal too much, but what does the title refer to? The Lachrymose Primrose? Is that like a sad flower? Or is there a character that's kind of sad and flower-like and dainty and delicate and colorful? And
so the main premise behind this, and it sounds completely absurd, but I like things that you never know what can cause a... And you find out later on in the movie, which I can't divulge, why the lead character was driven mad by the loss of his dead primrose flower.
So that sounds Poe-like, like something so magnified that on the surface, that seems weird, like an overreaction, but it sounds like it's symbolic of a much bigger mental state.
Yeah, the flower, which is actually a large bouquet of primrose flowers, is actually very representative and very it has a story behind it. I'm trying not to talk too much about it, but I can talk about this part. It's just very meaningful for him, and the loss of those flowers almost represent a loss of a certain relationship that he has, and it just sends him over the edge.
Mm-hmm.
Where the random outsider would be like, "Dude, come on, man, your flowers died, no big deal." But for him, it really drove him to the brink of madness.
So is this a period piece?
So, no, it's nondescript. I mean, you'll be able to tell that it's somewhat modern and contemporary, but it's like I'm thinking back to some of the props that are used in the scenes, and I mean, a lot of it. The house that we're filming in was built in the 50s. A lot of the furniture would be nondescript errors. I would say probably, if anything, you might pick it up to be from like the 70s or 80s.
Because just using the word
Like
primrose, it just sounds like such an antique flower. Just, you don't hear people refer to primrose much. I just picture something from Victorian times.
Yeah, which is really great because I had to order a bunch of primrose off of some gardening websites, and I have to take care of these flowers and nurture them because I need them for the film. And so I almost feel like I might turn into my character by the time that it's all done because I've invested so much time in these plants. So I hope that they live quite a while on me. But no, I would say it's nondescript era, maybe 70s or 80s. I really wanted to experiment with color and sound and a lot of things that I wasn't really able to do with the Noctambulist.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, to wrap, Lachrymose Primrose. So we're going to remember that. This is just kind of like a sneak preview. They're just going to have to stay in touch and see how that develops. Is there any...
I created a Facebook page for it, but I haven't invited anybody to it yet. So if somebody's listening and they're like, hey, I want to get in on this while it's still fresh in my mind, you can go to Facebook, type in the Lachrymose Primrose. You'll find the films page with no likes, but don't let that throw you. It's just, I wanted to create the page and then I've been sitting on it.
They're going to have to Google
really publicity I've done.
Lachrymose to know how to spell it.
Yeah, they might. And I didn't even make an IMDb page for it yet either. That's how hush-hush I've been. So I've given you a really first sneak peek on that film.
Noctambulist had a pretty long time from start to final release. Are you going to condense this a little more, have a little more scheduled out, like I'm going to have this done and released by this date?
I don't know if I could bring myself to that. Noctambulist, we didn't, a lot of it because we're working, when you have an indie film and you can't really afford to pay your actors or pay them much of anything, you kind of have to shoot around their 9 to 5 work schedule, which can delay things sometimes. Because, I can't ask you to leave your job that you're getting paid for to come out and work on a film that has no budget or a very micro budget. So, but still at that, Noctambulist didn't take that long to film. I'd say maybe a total of 3 months. But as we mentioned earlier in the interview, my main problem is I took 2 years editing it because I'm like, no, I can't let it go yet. I'm not ready. And I'm glad that I sat on it. So my thing is, obviously, I don't want it to marinate too long, but I do feel that sometimes when you take a step back and you let it marinate for a while, I don't think that Noctambulist would have been what it was if I hadn't taken the time.
Mm-hmm.
And see, that's the whole different contrast to how I started off. Guerrilla style filmmaking. Let's film, shoot, edit, done, release, out. And it was real rushed. And now it's like I've learned so much, and I'm so much more particular about every nuance of the film. But I'm like, hey, let's get it done. And when it's time for it to be released, it'll come out. Not to go again back to The Cure, but they keep saying they've been working on an album for 10 years now, and it keeps getting pushed back. So it's not going to wait that long. But, if once we enter post, if it takes a year or two to edit it, my main concern is just having the film be the best that it can be before it's released.
So you mentioned that Facebook page for the film. Is there any one-stop page or website where people can, keep up to date on you?
I do have a JD Ellenberger Facebook page, which I'm terrible at updating. That would be the best one-stop shop for everything. But if you're into Noctambulist, you can go to Facebook, / the Noctambulist, or you can go to Facebook for the Lachrymose Primrose. or JD Ellenberger, which I need to update that more often.
Well, to wrap up, I want you to speak directly to people like you, you 30 years ago, when you like punk, you like alternative, you just like, what you like, you're discovering music and movies and books and art, and you think, wow, I have an artistic spirit. I want to do, what Johnny's doing, or Mr. J.D. Ellenberger. One day I want to grow up and turn into J.D. Ellenberger, but you can't quite narrow it down, and you want to try some things, dip your toes into different waters. But what's your advice to a young creative person, that wants to make their mark and find their own unique voice, but doesn't quite know what that vehicle's going to be?
Yeah, watch, read, and listen to as much as you possibly can, because you're never going to know. Don't have any preconceived notions about anything. I always say this. I like all genres of everything. Everything. Like, everybody looks at me because I'm tattooed and they're like, you love metal. And I'm like, no, I actually hate metal. But then I don't actually hate metal, because out of that genre, there might only be a band or two bands that I like. But there's always something in the genre. So on a whole, do I like it? Nah, not so much. Doesn't appeal to me. Too aggressive, not really my thing. But there's certain bands, there's a band or two from that genre that I like. I used to, years ago, before I became a filmmaker, I had a coworker that was like, she was significantly younger, probably 10 to 12 years younger than me. And she's like, I hate black and white movies. They're stupid. That was her exact words. And I said, Courtney, why? Why do you hate black and white? They're just stupid. Well, have you ever seen one? No, I just don't like the fact that they're in black and white. That's just not cool, or it's just dumb. So she had this preconceived notion that all black and white movies are terrible because they're black and white. So do as much as you can with everything that you can, because you never know what you're going to be influenced by and what's going to inspire you. And, I had this talk with one of my best friends the other day. His daughter's getting married at a very, very young age, and she's pregnant. And I hope he doesn't listen and get pissed off at me. But I was like, hey, I wish him the best of luck. I hope it works out. And he's like, well, that's really pessimistic. And I'm like, look, you're not the same person when you're 17 or 18 as you're going to be when you're 30 or when you're 40. You haven't even found everything out about yourself yet. And if you're in a serious relationship at that age and you find yourself married, you have to make sure that your partner grows at the same time you grow, or else you guys are going to end up going separate ways. It's inevitable. So that's why you don't really know yourself as an artist until you've discovered everything. You might not think that you like jazz or the blues or, metal music or goth or rockabilly music, or you might not like silent movies or black and white movies or action movies or westerns. Take it all in. Take it all in. There might be one thing from that particular genre that you adore that's going to really influence the way that your art turns out to be in the future. And you could still be unique and be inspired by a lot of different mediums. So,
are your early fans who got to know you through a more goth, punk rock, alternative Johnny Daggers, are they accepting your evolution as an artist?
Yeah, I think so. I talked to a really good friend of mine about the name change before I did it. And I'm only going to mention this because he told me to bring it up on the air. He's like, I think it's a funny story that your fans will get a kick out of. But I don't know. Have you ever seen the movie Love in a 45?
I know of it.
Starred Renee Zellweger back in the day. Really big film in the 96, 97. Anyway, the director of that cult film, C.M. Talkington, he and I were talking because I had him on my radio show a couple months ago, and we became really close. And in a way, we kind of mentored one another, even though he's a little bit older. I think he's like 51 or 52, just a couple years older than me. But we both kind of gave each other a lot of advice on things. And he got out of the indie film world. Love in a 45 is the only movie that he ever made. Had Renee Zellweger, Peter Fonda was in it, I'm sorry. And Gil Bellows was in it. But, and then his music was his life and his passion. So we had a lot in common. I'm like, CM, like, I don't know. I never thought I'd be in the film world, and I thought I'd always do music and this, that, and the other. And I'm thinking about changing my image just because it's better suited to where I'm at nowadays. And I said, tell me honestly, do you think it's going to hurt? Do you think that if I rebrand and people might not realize I'm the same guy? Somebody like Johnny Daggers might not know that JD Ellenberger is the same guy. And he's like, honestly, he's like, I really think that it would be in your best interest to rebrand. And him and I we were working with somebody together that she actually emailed him. I had contacted her and I said, hey, so-and-so, this is Johnny, and CM and I are working on this radio show together. And I was wondering if you could submit something for me. And apparently she never got back to me, but she messaged him directly. And she's like, I don't know, some weirdo Johnny Daggers messaged me. And is he legit? Because his name's kind of scary. And so, like, she's somebody that's a little bit more square that was actually really afraid of me just because of my name. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't think that Daggers really fits me. It doesn't fit my persona on a personal basis. It doesn't fit my direction as films. And I was thinking about changing it before that. She's not the reason why I changed it. But, and I said, CM, do you think that this is a good idea to rebrand? Or do you think that, it'll cause me to fall into obscurity? And he's like, I think you can rebrand, and I think that people can follow you, and that you're not going to lose fans. So I hope that people are accepting of that. I just think that my work has matured, and I've matured as a person. I think that we should always grow and be better than where we were. And I think that that's just emblematic. This name change and my direction for films just coincide with that.
Well, even at his peak, Prince changed his name.
Exactly. Yeah.
He was one of the most famous people on the planet when he did that.
Yeah, sometimes, especially when you get into things like such as myself, I didn't expect to find myself in the film world, and I just threw it out there, Johnny Daggers. I didn't think real hard about, are you going to like that name 10 or 15 years from now? And so sometimes you just grow and you're like, man, if I could take that all back and go back 10 years, I would have picked a different name. So now, I just wanted to, another thing about it too, real quick, Kelly, is that I wanted to start using my real name because over the past several years, I've always been proud of my family, but over the past several years, I've really got into ancestry and learning more about where I come from and my roots and my family, and love them all dearly. And, hopefully, my mother and father have a long time left on this earth, but you never know. And I just thought, I want my dad to see my name on the screen. Like, as my real birth name, I want him to see that up there and the rest of my family too, and so a lot of this I'm doing for my family as well as myself, without them even asking me to. I just thought that it was very important to carry the name of my family and not hide it. So
you're basically a professional wrestler. You make your name as The Rock, then all of a sudden you become Dwayne Johnson. And people follow him,
Another good point.
So it sounds like
another good point.
You're not alone. I think you'll survive the name change. So, well, just to rattle off, I encourage people to check out Noctambulist, the movie, your book, Neverlasting. Both of those are available on Amazon and other places.
Neverlasting has a Facebook page, too. I forgot to mention that.
Excellent. The modern-day Edgar Allan Poe. The upcoming documentary, Love to be Scared. The Lachrymose Primrose, soon to enter production. And I'm sure you'll have even more surprises for us this year.
I hope so.
All right. Well,
I really do. And I want to thank you for having me on the show. Like I said, we've been friends and colleagues now since 2013, probably. And I know we don't get to talk that often at all, but it was really a pleasure to reconnect, to see your face, too, to be able to do this via video and to see you. And I want to wish you the best on everything that you have coming up. And I'm always in your corner rooting for you, even if you don't get to hear from me. And, if you stop by and you're like, hey, how are you? I will definitely get back to you. I'm just terrible at initiating. But I do. I really think that you're a fantastic person. And I thank you also because you've been very supportive of my work since we first were introduced to one another. And it honors me and it pleases me, and I reciprocate that back to you. Just wish you the best with all your endeavors, and you're just awesome dude. So thank you.
I appreciate that. And if I ever make it out to Baltimore, I am going to force you to get out of your house and take me to Edgar Allan Poe's bar stool.
We'll go to Poe's bar. We'll track down John Waters.
Excellent. I would love to meet him. I've talked to him, but The one time I went there, somebody brought me to Divine's grave, and that was such a pilgrimage. I really enjoyed that.
I was going to ask you if you ever had it. My fiance is Baltimore born and raised, huge John Waters fan. If you came out here to visit, she could take you on a personal tour to all the filming locations and show you like she sits there, we're driving. She's like, oh yeah, John Waters filmed this there and that there. Yeah. And she knows it all. So we'll give you a guided tour of the
I love that. I got to see the exterior of the Hefty Hideaway from Hairspray.
Okay. Yep. That was one of the first things I saw too when I came here.
Oh my God. Okay, one last, so you take us out and just say one last little greeting to your fans.
Yeah, thank you for all of my friends and fans. I hate to say fans. I hate that word. I like to say thank you for those that like my work. I hate to use the word fan. It just makes me feel cringy. So anybody that likes my work, I'm my heart goes out to you. It means so much to me. And, somebody like me that wears my heart on my sleeve, if I didn't have any love or support from people, I would probably just quit doing everything. So those that support me, yeah, it really means a lot. So thank you.
Or better yet, close and reassure us that you're not being held captive in a brick cage.
I am not. Look, honestly, I promise you, I could tap on this and it moves. Look. It's fabric. So, yes, I'm alive. I'm well. I'm not held up in a cave or a wine cellar and walled up like a Poe story. So.